I'm going to discuss the Ming Dynasty in here, which is from 1368 to 1644, so originally 17th century. And it's in this period of what I call native and foreign rule. So the Song Dynasty or the Chinese Dynasty, then the Mongols took over. Then the Ming was able to reassert control, and then another Chinese-led dynasty, which then was lost to Manchurian, established the Qing, so that transition between native and foreign rule was pretty good. Back to this map, just to give you an idea of the territorial extent. The Ming considered Joseon a tributary state, so from a Chinese point of view, this map is done from a Chinese point of view. It includes this whole area here. And this was the most vulnerable border that the Ming felt against the Mongols. So they reestablished the Great Wall as a way of trying to keep the Mongols out, unpopulated as that. But in order to talk about the Ming Dynasty, and I spoke about this briefly when I talked about the end of the Yuan Dynasty, we have to start with this man, Zhu Yuanzhang, who's the founder of the Ming, known as Ming Taizu, sort of great ancestor. And he's a really interesting figure because there were very few emperors who started out as peasants. The first Han Emperor was one, and the first Ming Emperor was one. He started out really actually as a beggar in the streets, and in order to survive, he actually joined a temple as a teenager for this temple. But the Mongols, during their depredation in China, burned down the temple that he was living in. He left and he joined a rebellion called the Red Turban Rebellion, which was the sort of millennial rebellion that caught the end of World War IX and was fighting against the Mongol rule. And he rapidly rose in the ranks of the Red Turban armies, and soon was leading his own army of thousands of rebels. And at that point, there was sort of warlordism breaking out all over China, and the Mongols eventually just lost control completely and fled back to Mongolia. But the country was a mess, right, at this point, broken up between all these different regional warlords. And so Zhu Yuanzhang decided to make his base in the south part of China, well, relatively south, I guess, in Nanjing. South is the Mongol capital in Beijing, was known as Dabu at the time, the great capital. He established himself in Nanjing, and then used that as a basis from which to advance northward, probably to take Dabu, the great capital, which he did in 1368, and then declared a new dynasty. The Ming Dynasty himself as the first emperor. And Ming Taizu, he was an interesting character. He seemed to be sort of megalomaniacal and very paranoid at the same time. And he raised the status of the emperor to that of a near deity. So the idea of being in a forbidden city behind walls, you can't look at the emperor. And all these things which brought to a great extreme under his rule. But he also was a sort of savvy administrator. So he ordered a new survey of the land in the empire at the time, and he lowered taxation to give people sort of respite, and had taxation paid in kind, so that the peasants growing grain could just use those grains to pay their taxes rather than having to convert them to currency or something else. He drafted a new legal code for China based on the Tang Dynasty code. So he's putting in place these sort of administrative infrastructure to bring stability to his empire. One thing he did, though, take over from the Yuan Dynasty was he kept these sort of provincial borders, which are roughly the same as modern provincial borders in China, and kept that sort of provincial structure. Because it was easier for an emperor to keep track of the fewer, bigger provinces that each had their own governor, rather than having a bunch of little regions all reporting to the court, which is what was the model before. The flip side of that, of course, is if you have this regional independence, it's fine if everyone is loyal to the emperor, but as well it allows these regions to build their own power bases, which can lead to fragmentation. But he had a very sort of strict tyrant control over his government, to the point where actually he didn't even allow his own sons to remain in the capital because he was afraid they would plot against him. So he sent them to serve in the far reaches of the empire. He also adopted another Yuan dynasty practice, which was the sort of hereditary caste system where you're born as an artisan or born as a merchant or born as a soldier, then that's the way you would remain, that's the way the children would remain. There was very little social mobility during this period. So these class divisions that were sort of brought out as a way of controlling the Chinese population under the Mongols were continued as a kind of sort of economic control under the Ming government. Certainly not as much social mobility as in the Song dynasty. He also tried to revive this idea of a military class who were also farmers. So you would farm for part of the year, and then part of the year you would serve as a soldier. In particular, he used that along the northern borders of China to have a standing army against possible Mongol invasion. But that met with a lot of desertion because people, there wasn't someone there to make sure that they were serving as soldiers, and they often wouldn't. But he had this romantic vision of the entire Chinese Empire being a sort of collection of peasant villages. And he was quite strict in his Confucian sort of ideas, loyalty to the emperor, and he actually promulgated a law that didn't allow people to leave their villages for, I think the limit was 30 miles or 30 leagues. You couldn't go for 30, or maybe it was 100 leagues, 30 miles. You couldn't go for more than 30 miles away from your home village unless you had special permission from the government, a special traveling papers. And you couldn't leave the empire without special permission under pain of death. If you left the empire, you had to come back. So he exerted a lot of control over social mobility as well as physical mobility of the people at the time. He was prone personally to sort of outbursts of paranoia and cruelty. Sometimes he would purge his official class, killing thousands of them for apparently no good reason, except perhaps that they criticized something that he did. And he was actually convinced that officials were using poetry to mock him behind his back, writing sort of satires about them. So he was not a sort of an official he wanted to serve under. I mean, an emperor he wanted to serve under as official, which created problems for the Ming, which continued with his sons in finding good, able officials that were willing to speak their mind, willing to be critical of the government. It just became more and more difficult to do that. The Ming actually wanted to return to the sort of model of the glory of the Han Dynasty and the Tang Dynasty. I talked about two of those ages as being golden ages that later dynasties look back upon. And so the Ming saw themselves as wresting control of China back from the Mongols, and they wanted to return to this sort of Han Dynasty model. So they had a constant sort of fear that the Mongols would reinvade and take away Chinese territory, which led to a rebuilding of the Great Wall. Many of you are familiar with it, of course. This is a modern-day restoration of a Ming Dynasty section of the wall. Here is an interesting map, which you might see more clearly when I post it as a slide. All of these blue lines are the different walls from different periods, from 5th century BC onward, that were built and then fell into disrepair. And then this purple line is the sort of extent of the Great Wall of the Ming, which the Great Wall reached its longest extent. To give you an idea of the scale, it would stretch from Toronto to Miami. You can walk all the way along the wall from Toronto to Miami. If you were to go over here. I just did that on Google Maps to see how far it would stretch. So the last Yuan emperor fled Dabu, the capital, 1368, and then Zhu Yuanzhang, the first Ming emperor, eventually took over Dabu, Beijing himself, established the Ming capital. And the Mongols never were able to reinvade China, although China was never able to invade them either. So the kind of constant sort of ongoing back and forth. The Ming government would get together sometimes armies of hundreds of thousands of men and march into Mongolia, and all the Mongols would do was they would ride away. They would ride somewhere else. And so the Chinese armies would be standing around in the empty grasslands wondering what to do. No one to fight, nothing to conquer, nothing to take over, nothing to occupy. So they would turn around and go home, and then the Mongols would come back again. So they finally gave up on that and switched to this defensive tactic of the Great Wall. And it wasn't very effective, actually, because they had these watchtowers, and they could send signals if there was an invasion. You know, they would light torches, and it would run along the watchtower. They would light a torch, they would light a torch, and then reinforcements would be sent. But all it took was for the Mongols to knock out one of these watchtowers, and it would break the line of communication, and then they could pour over the wall and through the wall. So it's more of a symbolic gesture than anything. But eventually, the Ming emperors decided not to let Mongols live in northern China. And so there was a sort of part of northern China, which I guess we would call Inner Mongolia today, which was basically Mongol territory under Chinese rule, and a kind of peaceable détente was reached. Along the coastline, the Ming curtailed trade quite a bit, and the Ming, especially the early Ming, were quite isolationist that way. Although there was still, through certain ports, trade was carried out. Silk and porcelain, later tea, were very popular items that were left China, and they were paid for by silver coins, which, interestingly enough, came from silver mines in Peru and Mexico by the Spanish and Portuguese who had their colonies over there. And the coins would be minted there, and they come all the way back to China. The Mexican coins were actually the common currency in Ming and Qing dynasty China. And there's extensive contact with the West during this period as well. So the next emperor, sorry, the succession of emperors, but both of these emperors are quite important for the Ming dynasty history, was Taizu's eldest son, who was known as the Yongle Emperor. And when he came to the throne, it was quite controversial because the succession actually says that there was a succession battle, and Taizu's nephew was actually chosen to be on the throne, but Taizu's son said, no, I should really be on the throne, and he took the throne away from the nephew and asked the nephew to be invested with the title of emperor. So some officials said that he was a usurper. And he was extremely martial, like his father, distrusted the civil bureaucracy at the time, and had a military reputation of winning victories over the Mongols, and also expanding Chinese influence southward into Vietnam. So this is a period, early Ming period, where we have a shift from the civil bureaucracy towards these sort of military leaders in the figures of the emperor himself. When one of the Confucian scholars spoke up about the legitimacy of the Yongle Emperor, he was killed along with his entire family, anyone who was related with him. Even anyone who took the imperial examination with this unfortunate scholar was also killed. Basically, any of his friends were killed. In fact, tens of thousands of people were either thrown in jail or executed because this one official spoke out against the legitimacy of the emperor. So there's that part of it, which you should know. But as well, there are other achievements, including this Yongle Encyclopedia, which is an important document. It was an attempt to compile all relevant knowledge on the Confucian canon, on history, on philosophy, and the arts and sciences into one massive encyclopedia. It was 11,000 volumes, 3.5 billion characters. It was compiled by 2,000 scholars over 5 years from 7,000 sources, and copied out in hand, by hand. 3 copies were made. These copies took years to make, and they were deposited in different places, but they were all mostly destroyed in the name of the Qing, burned different invasions and dynastic transitions. There are only about 400 volumes left of the original 11,000. Harvard University has a few of them. I've seen them, and they're quite beautifully written, but they're gone now. He had a new edition of the Confucian Classics compiled for examination. And it was actually during this period that Beijing became the official capital. So Taizu, the first emperor, started out in Nanjing and went to Beijing and declared himself emperor there, but really kept his base in Nanjing. Yongle, his son, moved the whole apparatus of the imperial government to Beijing and built the imperial city. And he used hundreds of thousands of workers over decades to build the imperial city of Beijing, which was continued to be used during the Qing dynasty as well. It supposedly has if you count up all the rooms in it, there are 10,000 rooms in this palace. He also rebuilt the Grand Canal to connect the south part of China to the north part of China that was destroyed by the Mongols. But all of this infrastructure that he built up was just supported the succession of emperors that came after the Yongle Emperor, who were very weak, immature, debauched, lazy, cruel, or all a combination of the above. So the first two emperors were quite strong in military means, although they were cruel. The later emperors were not even strong. That had dire effects on the government because the first big emperor, Taizu, had abolished the position of the chancellor, which was the main civil official that actually ran the empire from day to day, and concentrated all power in the hands of the emperor. So the minute these weak emperors came to the throne, they couldn't run things anymore. And so they would turn to members of their inner court, which would often include eunuchs who served at court 24 hours a day, who were able to easily manipulate these young emperors. And so there was a rapid loss of imperial control over the empire at this time. In fact, the eunuchs grew in such power after the Yongle Emperor that they became a kind of shadow bureaucracy. So there's the civil bureaucracy, which is supposedly running things under the laws in name, and then there's a corrupt sort of eunuch bureaucracy that was really sort of running things from behind the scenes. And they would be so brazen as to forge edicts and block communications from the officials to the emperor, and issuing their own edicts, and if they didn't like what the emperor was trying to say. And so many officials who could afford to do so just stopped serving as officials hired at that point, and followed their own cultural pursuits, or they established academies and so forth. And so what you have in the Ming is this civil bureaucracy that's trying to work around an increasingly corrupt and incompetent imperial rulers and the eunuch bureaucracy, and they're met often with violence and cruelty when they protest directly. So it after it became a dysfunctional government. But that doesn't stop the Ming from expanding their territorial influence, not only over the Chinese mainland, but internationally. They reestablished a lot of the traditional Chinese trading routes and expanded them. So here's an interesting map here. There was a very famous admiral named Zheng He, who was a Muslim and a eunuch as well, but he helped the Yongle Emperor come to the throne when there was a battle of succession between the Yongle Emperor and Taizu's nephew. Zheng He was on the side of the Yongle Emperor. So once the Yongle Emperor took power, he gave Zheng He command of a vast armada and allowed him to build it. It's actually an incredible chapter in maritime navigation. There was an armada at one point of 317 ships, and some of them were as long as 440 feet. So to give you an idea of the scale, this is scale of the Santa Maria, Columbus's ship, when he traveled to the New World. This is the size of one of Zheng He's bigger ships in his armada. 32,000 sailors manned this fleet, and you can see here they went as far as India and Africa. They went up into the Red Sea even. A small party even went into Saudi Arabia to Mecca, and defeated Muslim faith and Zheng He himself was Muslim. And in their travels, they brought back all sorts of exotic items. So here's a nice scroll of a giraffe from Africa being presented to the Ming Emperor. These boats were so big, apparently they could grow crops on them, so they had soil and they would actually grow food on the deck of the ship. They were not actually voyages of exploration, really, because all of these routes that are depicted here were known routes. And the trade was almost restricted to bringing exotic gifts back to the emperor, although they did take spices, textiles, and so forth with them to barter and trade and so forth. Much of the trade at the time was really in the hands of private traders, not this imperial fleet. And so what it was a very, very expensive, but albeit very impressive expression of Chinese imperial power, for consumption within China itself, as well as an expression of power throughout the world at the time. But it was too expensive to maintain. The fleet was under constant criticism from Confucian officials, saying it was a waste of taxpayers' money, waste of the government resources. And eventually, one of the Ming emperors lost interest in it, and the entire fleet was dismantled and used as lumber. And at one point, the Ming emperor even slated all of Chinese ocean-faring ships for destruction, and said that China doesn't need to have any contact with it. Well, that edict was never carried out, but it was a sign or symptom of the isolationism which started happening in the early Ming period. As the Ming progressed, it became a different story, though. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. First of all, something about the examination system at this time. You might remember from the Song Dynasty, I mentioned Zhu Xi, the Neo-Confucian philosopher, who boiled down all the Confucian classics to 4 books that you had to know. This was revived in the Ming Dynasty, an examination that was based on these 4 books. But in order to make things a bit more difficult, because it was it's not easy, but it was easier for people to memorize these 4 books. So everyone knew the curriculum inside and out in terms of the Confucian classics. So in order to test their skill, it wasn't so much whether you knew the books or not, it was whether you knew how to write a formal style of essay, which was called Baguwen in Chinese. It means 8-legged essay. So each essay had 8 parts to it, and they had to be balanced. Each one was carefully balanced rhetorically, in terms of, if you made an argument along this line, you had a counter-argument along this line, and so forth. Very formal, rigid style to this type of essay. And then you had to pass 3 levels of examination, going from county levels, provincial levels, and capital level, and only then would you be eligible for office. And so although hundreds of thousands of people are trying to take these exams and advance to the ranks, only about 100 men actually made it to the very top each year. But in order to have a chance at all, you have to put your child into full-time schooling from the age of about 4 or 5 years old. And people like tutors and sort of private schools were opened up at the time. And that was the one path for social mobility for people through the examination system. So that's why they're so common. The exams themselves were a grueling affair. By the time you were at the county level, it was about a day, but by the time you got to the provincial and national level, it was a week-long examination, and you were basically locked into these little cells here. And you were given food and water, and allowed to use the bathroom, but for 7 days you would write your examination. There were also strict procedures to prevent cheating, but we have also some interesting documentation of how people could cheat, including they would have their gowns, they would have a special lining in their gowns they could take out and then have everything written down. I shouldn't give people ideas, I guess. They had all sorts of different ways of trying to get around the system. And stories of how hard people studied, right? Not only going to school since we're 4 years old, but they had stories of people tying, men with their hair long, and so men would tie their hair to a rafter above them to keep their head from nodding off while they're studying. Or they would take a needle, and if they felt themselves nodding off, they'd poke themselves and wake themselves up again. There's a whole book called Examination Hell about what it was like to go through this system. And perhaps in response, partially at least, to this rigid way of writing on the examination system and this sort of fixation on passing the examination system, passing the exam, in order to serve. There was a sort of new generation of free thinkers that kind of started to grow up in the Ming period. Particularly, Wang Yangming is an early example, but the 16th century, so near the end of Wang Yangming's life, there was a kind of explosion of all these iconoclastic thinkers that are just sort of sick of the sort of traditional Confucian straitjacket. And Wang Yangming is an interesting figure because he identified himself as a Confucian, or what we would call a Neo-Confucian, because he followed on from the teachings of Zhu Xi. But he was quite radical in his claims. He thought that this universal truth was inherent in the human mind, and it did not come from text. You didn't actually have to read the Confucian classics in order to appreciate those truths. Those truths were already a priori knowledge that you were born with. And in fact, your goal was to clear your mind of false distractions and false knowledge and allow this truth to emerge on its own. But that truth, once it emerged, was useless unless it was put into action. So the other sort of tenet of Wang Yangming's teaching was to put morality into action. So filial piety cannot be learned by mere talk. You actually have to act in a similar way in order to understand it. It's sort of influenced by Chan, or what's known as Japan as Zen Buddhism, this idea of having sudden enlightenment. And Wang Yangming himself, I think he said it was in 1508, one night had a Confucian enlightenment, right, where he saw this inherent truth. And so to some extent, Wang Yangming started a suspicion towards textual authority, scriptural authority, which is important in terms of, while that wasn't a sect of Buddhism, in Chan Buddhism, this is the first time we see it entering the Confucian mainstream. Because Confucianism at this point has been very much holding the Confucian text as sacrosanct. There's a question. Another 17th century Ming Dynasty, 16th century Ming Dynasty intellectual sort of took this and ran with it. I gave you a reading from one of them named Li Zhi, probably the most outrageous of them, who wrote a book called The Book for Burning. Right? You shouldn't read this book, you should just burn it. But if you do care to read it, he had an essay called The Tongxin, or the Childlike Mind, which he was taking Wang Yangming's ideas to an extreme, this idea that we're born with the mind that knows truth, and then anything we learn after that is actually moving away from truth. And Li says in that essay, once people's minds have been given over to received opinions and moral principles, what they have to say is all about these things, and not what would naturally come from their childlike minds. No matter how clever the words, what have they to do with oneself? What else can there be but phony people speaking phony words, doing phony things, writing phony writings? Once the people become phonies, everything becomes phony. Thereafter, if one speaks phony talk to the phonies are pleased. If one does phony things that the phonies do, the phonies are pleased. And if one discourses with the phonies through phony writings, the phonies are pleased. Everything is phony and everyone is pleased. I think that would make a good bumper sticker, actually. Everything is phony and everyone is pleased. Sounds like Holden Caulfield. The term is jia in Chinese, is fake quality. Jia, actually, it's interesting from Chinese, jia does not only mean phony or fake, it means borrowed, right? And which is what Li Zhi is getting at. I didn't have a picture up here, sorry. This idea that it's all borrowed knowledge, and it's borrowed knowledge that is necessarily phony. Li Zhi, by the way, ended up being thrown in prison. His iconoclastic writing. It was also an age of economic development, particularly the late Ming. So I don't know if you remember, a few slides back I had a population chart that showed the increase in Chinese population. And the Ming is when it really exploded. There was a doubling of the population from about 70 million at the beginning of the Ming to 170 million. That's more than double, I guess, near the end of the Ming. And there's a sort of vibrant culture that grew up in the major cities. This is giving the elements of cities for this lecture, where there was an urban commercial culture in these major cities because the population supported. And rich families build these beautiful gardens. One of the most famous of these cities is Suzhou, which is full even to this day. It's worth visiting as a city full of gardens built by these wealthy families. And book publishing completely exploded, far beyond what was in the Song Dynasty. It became a very profitable venture. So Ming book publishers were actually making good money by bringing out all sorts of books, including practical manuals, anthologies for how to pass examinations, you know, like the Kaplan and the Princeton Review, those sorts of things, how to pass the SAT. The exact same thing was being published in China at this time. They were very popular. Lavishly illustrated works, as an example here of a popular novel called Shui Wu Duan, or Water Margin. So these works, which sometimes stretch back to the Song Dynasty, were reissued in these beautiful illustrated editions. And the Ming is known for an explosion in novels and vernacular fiction. Poetry continues to be written throughout Chinese history, but there's sort of different genres of literature which come to the fore in different dynasties. The Ming is known for vernacular fiction as well as drama. Many dramas were published in printed form as well. In fact, there are 4 books, which I've listed here, known as 4 masterworks of Ming fiction. The Fuda Qi Shu in Chinese. The Water Margin, or Shui Wu Duan, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the San Bo Ye Yi, Journey to the West, Xi You Ji, and Common and Golden Days, all 4 of these very popular. This last one is known as a classic of pornography in China, Common and Golden Days. When it was first translated into English, the translator translated all the sexual portions into Latin rather than English, figuring that if you were cultured enough to know Latin, you would not be debased by reading this text. Modern Chinese traditions sometimes take all those parts out of it. Anyway, I have another lecture on that book, but it's not appropriate for here. So it was an age of conspicuous consumption within these cities and increased literacy. There are some estimates that up to 40–50% of the male population, at least, were literate at this time, and a significant portion of the female population was also literate. There were books that were specifically published for female readers. And private sort of commerce began to explode. So the merchant class became very wealthy and influential. And in the Ming, it was actually possible to be a merchant and use your money to purchase a government position. So you didn't have to go through the examination system if you didn't want to. So these sort of strict rules of keeping people in certain classes that were in the early Ming began to relax under these sort of economic pressures as people gained wealth and influence through other means. In fact, I mentioned before how the Grand Canal was rebuilt, roads were rebuilt, and the ease with which trade was now took place in the empire also led to an explosion in internal tourism because the restrictions on movement, physical movement, were relaxed as well in the late Ming. So you have all sorts of guidebooks, like the Farmer's Guide or Let's Go Guide and Lonely Planet Guide, that are published at this time to show you, the different parts of China, the different temples, and different mountains you should see, and so forth. So there's a big sort of movement in the population now in the late Ming. International trade was still restricted in the late Ming period, but in the 16th century, this was all happening, the early 1500s, the 16th century, the Ming government did open up certain ports to allow foreign trade to enter China. The first of those was in 1509 in Guangzhou, which is also known as Canton, which they set up a little island that they allowed foreign merchants to come and meet with Chinese intermediaries on that island and bring in foreign goods. Usually they weren't bringing in foreign goods. China had everything it wanted. Usually they were there to get they were there to get silk and spices and ceramics and so forth, and they were paying with silver. Another port was opened up in Fujian, 1567, and the Portuguese arrived soon after, as early as actually 1513, and then they built a base in Macau, which they held until the 20th century. And the Spanish followed, and the Dutch actually established themselves on the island of Taiwan, they refer to as Formosa. So during this period when the Ming Dynasty opened up trade from Europe, there was a massive influx of silver into China from Europe, and that silver was actually coming from European colonies in the New World, Mexico and Peru and places like that, to buy all the porcelain and silk and lacquer and tea. And this imbalance in trade, where all these goods were leaving and all the silver was going into China, eventually led to most of the world's silver ending up in China, which led to economic pressures in the early modern period, which we'll talk about in 105, the Opium War. Sometimes it's interpreted as an attempt by the British to find something that the Chinese would buy to get silver back out of China and settling upon opium as a drug, and then forcing China to accept it through warfare. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's for the next course. New technology and ideas were flowing into China at this time. Much of that actually came through Jesuit missionaries, who were well received at the Ming Dynasty court. Mateo Ricci is one of the famous you may have heard of. And they were well received because they took the time to learn the Confucian classics, to learn sort of the Chinese history, and learn to speak Chinese. Mateo Ricci was often seen as one of the first Westerns who could speak Chinese fluently, although I'm sure there were West Chinese, that's kind of cute that I should have said that. The Tang Dynasty, there were plenty of people that were from the West that came to China and learned how to speak Chinese. So scratch that. But what the Jesuits did is they not only acted as a conduit for knowledge to come into China, but they also started reporting back outside of China to Europe. So during this period, the Europeans were shocked to discover that Chinese history actually predated the biblical flood. Right? It was actually civilization that was older than supposed civilization that they talked about in the Bible. And ideas about Confucianism and civil bureaucracy influenced the European Enlightenment at this time. Thinkers such as Lucan and Voltaire that directly cite their ideas of Chinese Confucian rule as influencing their own thought. But even as all this was happening, as I mentioned, to go back to the political story that I talked about before, the Ming government started to decay and go broke. They were spending a lot on campaigns to defend Korea against Japanese invasion. I'll talk more about that next week when we look at the Joseon dynasty. And they were faced with succession of natural disasters, floods, famines, and so forth. So it's the same story that is told over and over again. It's this idea of the central government starting to fall apart as natural disasters cause rebellion throughout the provinces. And the bureaucracy spent its time sort of assigning blame, and as bureaucracies do, removing people from office, rather than trying to solve any of the problems that plague the people. And finally, there were some poor crops in the year 1627 to 28, which basically meant there was just no food for people in the northern part of China, and they had nothing left to lose. So they started joining bands of roving bandits looking for food. And rebelling against government officials, trying to open up the government granaries and so forth. And the Ming was unable to raise the funds to hire enough soldiers to put them down. And there were two bandit leaders that actually emerged during this time, and their war against each other basically brought the entire Ming dynasty to its knees. And the last Ming emperor hanged himself in the forbidden city. And the loyalist generals who were left trying to fight against these rebels without an army and now without an emperor turned in desperation to Manchurian forces just to the northeast of China and asked them for help in putting down the rebellion. They promised them great rewards in return for doing that. And the Manchus who decided that they would do that helped follow the rebellion. But then they decided to stay afterwards and establish their own dynasty. So that was the end of the Ming dynasty establishment of the Qing in 1644. The Qing dynasty is the last, and I don't have a lecture on the Qing, I just want to talk about it briefly here though, because the 1600s is kind of the break point between this course and the next course. But it was the last of China's imperial dynasties, and the one in which sort of modernity took hold in China. And I'll talk a bit more about what I mean by modernity next week when I talk about modernity in Asia. But I just want to point out that modernity in China and in Korea and Japan as well is formed from both external and internal sources. Right? So often modernity is seen as something that comes from the West, from Europe, technological innovation from Europe coming to East Asia and being imposed on the outside, and from the outside there's reaction of East Asia against it, and that's used to characterize modernity. But we can look at elements even of Ming Dynasty society that are already the precursors for what we would call modernity in Qing, including the spread of literacy, the spread of the creation of a sort of idea of a large leadership that participated in the management community through the printed word. The iconoclastic scholarship of the Ming Dynasty, the distrust of the ancient texts as authorities, looking to the self as a source of authority. These are strong indications of modernity which stretch which are far earlier than all the contacts of the West that happened during the Qing Dynasty. But during the Qing was a time in which, politically and militarily at least, China's relationship with Europe as well as with Korea and Japan was radically transformed. So what I want to do next week is talk about the transformation of Korean society during the Joseon dynasty, and then sort of tie it all up with the roundup of modernity in East Asia, and set you up for 105. So for the last lecture, this is the readings here. As well, I'll spend some time next week talking about the examination, what to expect on that. And remember, your final version of the essay will be December 5th, and you'll receive more instructions about that. And please remember to send your tutorials